Hi guys, Garage RC here, back with another video. So it's been a little while since my last upload. I've been busy and I've got a video for you today. I'll just go quickly into what I've been up to, but before I do that, please like the video if you like the video and subscribe to the channel. All your subs count. We need the channel to grow so I can commit more time to it and provide more content. So please subscribe to the channel and keep giving your support. So what have I been up to for the last 3 weeks? Well, quite a few of you got in touch with me off Instagram, and I think there was a worldwide shortage of mini RC cars, especially the all-wheel drive variety. So I had a few people ask me if I would want to make them a car or sell one of my cars to them. So I ended up doing some custom builds for some of you guys, and this is one of them here. This is going to go off tomorrow. This is a BMW M3 GTR 98mm wheelbase on an AMZ chassis. The wheels you see here are not standard spec mini Z wheels. They're actually much bigger in diameter, and the actual tires that go around them would not fit a standard mini Z wheel. So you can see they look much bigger. So this is the kind of thing I've been doing. So this one's got a locked rear diff, front one way, and it's set up for drifting with a 3500 kV motor. And I've tuned it up, ready to go. It's also got a gyro, so that will help with the drifting. But yeah, this is the kind of fun stuff I've been doing. I don't know if I can bear to part with this shell, it's so beautiful. Anyway guys, so today's video is about drifting. So I'm going to talk about how to sort out drifting problems that arise. So before you watch this video, it might be a good idea to check out my video on steering fixes, just to make sure that you've sorted all those problems first. So if you haven't watched that already, there'll be a bit in the top right hand of the screen where you can click on and you can watch that video. So today's video is specifically about, you've got a car that you've already had set up for drifting. So we're not talking about angles of the wheels, if it's got a front one way or a rear lock diff. This is a car that you've been drifting with already, and suddenly it stops performing like it should. What do I mean by that? Well, maybe you're drifting one way, it drifts fine, you're drifting the other way, and the car's spinning out. So this is where I'm going with this video. It's about problems that arise with a car that was working perfectly, then suddenly isn't anymore. So this applies to both Mini Zs and AMZs, GLAs, and even say a BZ3 or an SZ. A lot of these tips are universal. So the first tip relates to bearings and drive shafts. Now the drive shaft part we will have covered in the steering fixes, but this is something a little bit different. So first thing you want to check is that the bearings aren't damaged. This has actually happened to me on a Mini Z, where the bearing itself had become damaged, so that it was broken and the drive shaft was wobbling. That I didn't notice initially, but then the bearing broke completely, and what would happen is the drive shaft would spin so much and lock, and that was causing the car to spin out in the right hand side. That was not always evident at first, then eventually the bearing just broke fully and I could see what it was. But it's a good place to start. So check both the bearings on the inside and the outside of your knuckle and see that that's okay. The other thing to check while I'm there, so this applies to the same tip here now, is the drive shaft. Before, I've had this with my SZ, where the joint in the drive shaft, particularly with some metal drive shaft, the joint has become warped, and every now and again it jams. That can have a knock-on effect. It can actually affect the rest of the drivetrain. So the wheel keeps jamming, car keeps spinning out, and that damage can extend to your diff. It can go on to cause problems where the diff then starts to get the gears stripped, or it wrecks the diff. So it's one to watch out for. Usually the problem eventually will reveal itself when the drive shaft breaks. That doesn't always happen, and it can be very frustrating in the meantime. But yeah, this is something that has happened on my Mini Z, the bearing breaking. The drive shaft is more I've had on the SZ, but it can happen on an AMZ too. So that was tip number one. Well, actually, before we finish this tip, a few simple points. This relates more to cars that you assemble rather than a Mini Z. Make sure that these kingpins that you've got here for the steering, for the knuckle, that the thread, the screw itself, isn't coming into the place where the bearing would go. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the lighting right there, guys, so you can see that. that it doesn't extend too far. So you may have to loosen that if it's extending too far. Okay, so that's drifting tip number 1. So tip number 2 applies to diffs, especially ball diffs. Now, I'll give the Mini Z a heads up, compliment here, because the Mini Z diffs that come with the all-wheel drive cars are closed up, and even though they're very loose, they very rarely actually go wrong. They're very reliable, they're very durable. These ball diffs are more fancy, have more moving parts. You can tune them, you can adjust them, but it also makes them prone to problems. So, problem I've had before, drifting car, working nicely, and then it suddenly starts to not behave like it did, and if anything, starts to spin out more easily, or you just can't seem to hold the drift, and this gradually gets worse. And it could be because if you've got ball diffs in the front or the rear, they've gotten loose and you need to tighten them again. Now, you have to be careful when you're tightening these ball diffs, because there's a little screw that goes in here and you have to hold the collar there, the little plastic collar that you can see. Actually, it's metal on this one there. You hold that and then you can tighten it or loosen it. Left is loose, right is tighten. Now, if you over tighten it, you can strip the thread on the screw that runs through the middle, and then your diff won't work anymore at all. In that case, you might have to end up having to lock the diff with glue or something. But the idea is that you should just tighten it enough so the diff regains its performance. You can get spare center shafts from Miracle Mart if you do find you've done that. I always keep a few spare lying around just in case. But that will definitely affect the handling of your car where it was once normal. So this applies more to ball diffs, and it can be the case that the ball diff itself, has expired and you have to get a new one. So yeah, watch out for that, because it sneaks up on you. The diff progressively gets loose, and the easy way to diagnose is when you turn the wheel just runs freely. It doesn't even turn the other wheel in the opposite direction like a normal differential would do. So I tend to keep mine quite tight anyway for drifting. Okay guys, tip number 3. Now, tip number 3 relates to something similar that we covered in the steering fixes, which is the ride height and suspension. If your ride height is uneven, now this shouldn't be the case if you've been running the car and it's all fine, but sometimes things go wrong. The car takes a knock, you lose a screw, a joint gets moved out of position. Well, with the AMZ, we've got adjustable ride height screws at the back that we use. I put quite big ones in here now after a recent issue I've had where I lost one of these. And on the rear, you can put the bigger ones in because there's no steering knuckles to get in the way. On the front, you have to keep them quite small, probably the ones that come with the kit. Now, why is it important? Well, if you lose one of these screws, instantly one side, the suspension tension will change because the wheel will travel further, and your car will be jacked up on one side. You may not notice this at first, but you might find that as you're drifting and turning, one wheel is lifting up and that's causing your car to spin out. It could be a front wheel, it could be a back wheel, but you need to set that straight if you want the car to turn and drift properly. Equally, the suspension settings have to then be matched up. So if your tension is unequal either side, the car will spin out. Now, obviously, if you set the car up and it was working okay, the suspension shouldn't be an issue, but if any of the moving parts get stiff or locked, or get dust or dirt in them, or the plastic, just the wishbone takes a knock, all these things will affect how smooth the drivetrain is. So you need to check that, and if that's smooth, then you're fine. Put your screw back in for the ride height adjustment, and this does apply to Mini Zs as well. So if you've got a DWS rear double wishbone suspension, you actually do get an Allen key with them to adjust the ride height so that you can make the car more even when it sits. Now with the front for Mini Zs, again, this shouldn't be an issue. You can adjust the ride height on these, but it's a bit more complicated. You have to use shims, and I can't remember the size of shims now you can put in, but you can put little washers in below the knuckle to adjust the ride height, and you can get these from most suppliers. Now I'll just measure them. Yeah, so they'd probably be about 2.8mm shims in terms of diameter there, and that would do the job. But yeah, ride height and suspension. If your suspension tension is unequal all of a sudden, or something is jamming your ride height, then your car won't drift equally in both directions. So that's something you have to almost do like a maintenance check on. Tip number 4. Okay, so this is a very interesting one, and this is something that can be caused by a drive shaft issue, which goes further down the line. Now, I've got a friend at the moment who's experiencing these issues for the last week, and we've been backwards and forwards trying to work out what was wrong, and eventually it came down to a broken drive shaft, which had in turn then damaged his front one-way diff, which then had also stripped this little cog in here. So what was happening, if we isolate each individual problem, first off, you're not getting power transferred to the front wheels properly because the cog's stripped. It's engaging, but then it skips. I'm doing this on purpose here just to show you what I mean. So you might get power one way, but when you go the other way, you don't, because the diff and the cog are no longer meeting together properly. So a stripped cog or a damaged diff. So if you've got a front one-way diff, this can happen as well. But if the cog is worn, you don't always have to replace it. You can shim the diff using, I think, 6mm shims. I'll put them up in the description later. And that can then change how tight the diff is against the cog. So you normally put them between the bearing and the diff here. So you put a shim in there so that the diff sits tighter against the cog. But that is something that normally when you assemble the car, you think that's it, it's done. But just like a real car, these things can wear out, parts can wear out, and you have to check these things. So again, this can cause the car to behave like a rear wheel drive, and that won't drift in an all-wheel drive setup. So check the cog, check the diff. What can go wrong with a one-way diff? Well, you can get it that even though they're only supposed to turn one way, if one wheel is locking and the other is moving, then that's going to cause problems with your drifting. So check the diff, and the symptoms can usually be found to have started from elsewhere. In this particular instance, I think it was a drive shaft that was about to break, which was causing the diff to lock, and it stripped the gears. So that's quite an important one. It's also a headache. You have to keep disassembling the car to work out what's wrong. But if you end up in that situation, try and think it out logically. Look at the drive shafts first because it's easier. Look at the wheels and the bearings first because it's easier. Only move on to the diff unless you really know it's the diff, or you can see an obvious problem like the front wheels aren't turning or the rear wheels aren't turning. Okay, so last tip here now is to do with your radio gear. I was going to put this in a separate video, but I thought if you're having trouble drifting and it was fine, it can get really frustrating. So I'll go over this briefly and I'll just include it as one tip. If you've got a steering servo, make sure it's working properly, that it's not stuttering, that the cogs haven't been stripped, and it's not jamming to one side if the pot is damaged. That can cause obvious issues if you're trying to drift if the wheels are locking to one side. An obvious one which people can overlook is if you've got a gyro, check that it's in the correct direction, that it's steering, counter steering, so you can slide, and not oversteering so you're spinning out. What do I mean by that? When you turn when your car slides to the left, your gyro should correct the wheels to the left. If your car's drifting to the right, the wheel should turn to the right. If when you're drifting, say to the left, the car starts steering in the opposite direction, so you're drifting this way and the wheels are turning that way, then the car will keep spinning out. This is an easy mistake to make if you've accidentally reset the gyro, or the gyro just decided to do it itself. With a Mini Z, you can have this issue as well if you accidentally have taken your gyro off and on and screwed it on upside down. That will make the car oversteer, but it's not really a proper problem. It's just something that can happen. But it's good to check out your radio gear and make sure it's all functioning correctly. Make sure when you're steering left to right that the car steering isn't locking in either direction. Make sure the steering wheel is returning to center. Just general radio related things. But the main things that frustrate you, usually the radio becomes evident quickly. It's these little things like a jamming drive shaft, for example. Thanks for watching, guys, and please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the sub button and drop me a like. And I'll see you guys all next time.